My name is Les Krusen. I'm a managing associate in Orrick's Seattle office in the public finance group, which if you're unfamiliar with that, that means that we work with various forms of state and local governments to issue bonds or other forms of financing. And just as an example, sort of the simplest form is a state bond offering or a school bond offering. And most of what I do is what I like to call the rust and crumble side of public finance. So it's a lot of work related to infrastructure projects, electric and water utilities, seaport and airport work, mass transit, as well as a substantial amount of work related to various green energy project financings. Most of the work I do is along the West Coast, from California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. But I'm also lucky enough to have a practice that spans sort of nationwide and all the way from Puerto Rico to Guam. The Grunin prize nominated project is called the Columbia Pulp Project. It's located in southeastern Washington along the Columbia River in a pretty rural part of the state. And just as additional background, the Columbia Pulp Project is a manufacturing facility, and it takes what's left over in the wheat fields, and the area is just completely surrounded by wheat fields. And it takes the leftover stalks and other wheat chaff and turns that into raw material for paper products and a handful of other useful co-products. So what you've got is effectively a sustainable pulp mill. So there are two primary problems that this project is working to resolve. One is these projects are typically encouraged to the extent they can be to be located in areas that have low rates of employment. And this is an area, as I mentioned, in very rural Washington that doesn't have a whole lot in the way of economic drivers aside from the pulp harvest. So this is a way to try to diversify the economy of the region. The additional problem that it's trying to deal with is various forms of environmental pollution. This all, in this particular circumstance, relates to the way that wheat is harvested. Here, once the harvest is completed, you've got a bunch of just leftover wheat stalks in the fields, and something needs to be done with that before it can be planted for the next year. And there are generally two options. One is burning everything in the field, which, as you can imagine, produce a lot of environmental pollution in various forms. The other is to plow all of that back into the field, which causes its own separate problem. If you plowed into the field, you're slowly going to degrade the quality of the soil. It's going to create erosion issues. You're going to need additional fertilizer, and that's going to cause its own environmental issues. So again, this takes something that would literally be burned or plowed under, causing its own issues, and actually makes a very useful product out of it. And I don't know exactly what the ratio of, pound for pound, what you put in as an input versus what comes out as a useful product. But my understanding is, and for tax purposes, it needs to be so. It makes certainly not a 1-to-1 ratio, but I think it's a pretty high ratio. The solution that this project was working towards is, first, in addressing the issues around employment, it creates quite a few jobs. There's the jobs that go into building the facility, and this is a full-blown large factory, and it's taken several years to build. It employs a lot of folks in the just sort of general construction trades, as well as some highly technical stuff that goes into building a facility like this. And then on a long-term basis, it continues to employ dozens of people in various roles. And so that's sort of the first economic employment related issue that it resolves. And then again, from the environmental standpoint, it is making use of what would otherwise be a waste product and finding a useful use for it. And it's a really interesting process that took several years to develop with actual scientists and actual labs, I think working with Washington State University. And, I am in no way capable of really getting into the nitty gritty of the way that the science actually works behind all of this. But, it's put something that is otherwise going to get burned or turned into the soil and make something useful out of it. So the lawyer's role really comes in at various different points. The lawyers need to get involved in a project like this relatively early on. And just to take a step back, one of the things that makes all of this tick, and one of the reasons why folks in the public finance sector, rather than just sort of pure project financing attorneys, get involved in projects like this, is that this kind of a project is eligible for tax-exempt financing. as in the interest on the bonds is exempt from interest for the investors in the project. And the reasoning there is that this is what's called a solid waste disposal project. And that can take many forms. In this case, it's taking wheat that's otherwise left over at the end of a harvest and making something useful out of it. There are lots of other projects like this, like taking waste in landfills and turning that into something useful. It is taking cow manure and putting that through a biodigester, and what comes out on the other end is useful methane that can just be pumped into the natural gas system along with other sort of forms of natural gas. We're working on another project that takes wood that's left over after lumber operations, as well as that gets coaled for wildfire purposes, and that gets turned into jet fuel. So there's a lot of different forms that these solid waste disposal financings can take. And so the lawyer's job is to then go through, from a tax standpoint, on an almost dollar by dollar basis to review what the dollars are being spent on for the project, and to determine whether or not that's an eligible cost that can be used for tax exempt financing. And so, for example, taking, the real nuts and bolts of the project, building the big tanks, pouring the concrete, all that sort of stuff qualifies as a good cost for tax purposes. So that is, the earlier you can get these lawyers involved, the easier it is to sort of shape the project through everything. There are lots of other roles, including sort of the more traditional bond counsel, which is actually my role. I anytime there's a tax question, I run to the tax experts to get their input on things, and it's really just sort of a highlighting role for me on the tax side. But once you start getting the bond attorneys involved, it's still relatively early in the process, and you're really sort of running through the traps to make sure that this project is eligible under various state and federal roles. There's a whole lot that happens with a lot of these projects in the background that the attorneys are involved with, and that really is sort of developing the real hard science behind some of this stuff. And at that point, the actual company may have their own attorney involved, but the earlier you can get the tax folks in particular involved, the better, because they can go through and help flag any issues that may cause problems for the tax exemption. And some of them, it might be there some traps for the unwary. There are management contracts that can come into place that need to be corrected or watched out for. And then again, it's just the nature of the way the tax exemption works. It's very helpful to have the tax attorneys there to go over line by line, work with folks at the company to get exactly what the expenditures are going to be used for, to make sure that in fact those do work for tax purposes. In terms of legal expertise, it really takes a village on projects like this. We've discussed a little bit the role that the tax attorneys play, and that continues throughout the course of the entire financing. As you get underwriters involved, they're looking at structuring the size of the deal to try and find the right size that the investing market actually is going to be interested in buying. And that can then, there's sort of a feedback loop where the tax attorneys need to have input on it. There's sort of traditional bond lawyers like myself who are working on the bond documents throughout the transaction, and it's putting together the indenture, it's putting together the various security agreements, and all of that's meant to be there to make sure that the dollars actually go out to investors in the way that they're expecting it, when they're expecting it. And it also deals with what happens if something goes wrong. What order of priority do various bondholders get paid out at? What stuff, so what collateral do they have access to pay off the debt? Then there are also, because these are securities, there are federal securities issues involved in putting together the offering documents. And then, we in public finance groups at firms around the country, as well as Orrick, we do these projects relatively frequently, and we've got a good idea of what's going on, but we don't live and breathe these projects in the way that a true specialist, for example, in our energy and infrastructure would. So we often bring in a little bit of help from those folks to provide any expertise they might have. as well as bringing in folks from our bankruptcy or secured financing groups. And again, there's a lot of traps for the unwary that can be sprung in terms of putting together documents for a transaction like this. So like I said, it takes a village. And one of the interesting things that happens when you're doing a tax-exempt financing for a project like this is that it just the nature of the way the investing funds are set up, a lot of dollars really aren't available to finance a project like this in the taxable market, because this is what's known as a high yield transaction. Interest rates 8%, 14%, something like that, because it's a risky project, and it's a high risk, high reward. And so once you bring in the tax exemption to a financing like this, then you're able to open it up to a much larger pool of investors who are interested in taking on this kind of risk, but with the tax exemption available.